This is the video on the discussion of NEET GT12 dental materials paper. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Aishwarya Kaushik. So the first question is from the casting investments and procedures. Very important topic. Which form of silica shows significant expansion at a low temperature? First of all, the answer guys, the answer here is cristobalite. Now let us get the answer in correct perspective. Okay, so you're talking of a situation in which you're talking of an investment material. Okay, now this can be a gypsum bonded, this can be phosphate bonded, this can be silicate bonded. Irrespective of what material we have, we do need a refractory material. Okay, now refractory material is basically silica in its various allotropic forms, and the most commonly used are quartz and cristobalite. Now you can have these quartz and cristobalites exclusively, like you can have a investment material which is comprising completely of quartz or comprising completely of cristobalite, or you can have some proportion of the refractory as quartz, some of it as cristobalite. That depends on the manufacturer. So refractory means that they give the investment the ability to resist high temperatures during casting and wax burnout. Okay, that's one. Second is they also compensate for the shrinkage that takes place at higher temperatures. Like gypsum would shrink typically between 200 to 400 degrees Celsius, right? Because the crystal form of gypsum slightly changes, right? Then phosphate bonded and silicate bonded would also shrink. Say for example, phosphate bonded also typically shrinks at higher temperatures between 400 700 degrees Celsius. Silicate bonded undergoes green shrinkage. So all that shrinkage has to be compensated for by expansion, so that ultimately the casting that you get, the restoration that you get, is of the correct size. Now quartz and cristobalite both would expand, right, as a function of temperature. Now typically quartz shows significant expansion at a given temperature, and that is roughly around 575 degrees Celsius. Okay, now that temperature for quartz is known as the inversion temperature. Inversion temperature is that temperature where it shows significant expansion, but the inversion temperature for cristobalite is relatively low. That's in the range of 200 to 275 degrees Celsius. Okay, so for cristobalite, the inversion temperature is pretty low. That is between 200 to 275 degrees Celsius. So that's the answer here. Okay, what is the other MCQ that you get related to this? That especially for those investment materials which contain cristobalite, so the associated or the applied MCQ is that for those investment materials consisting of cristobalite, you should be very careful in the sense that you should, while doing your wax burnout, do slow heating till you reach a temperature of 300 degrees Celsius. Why? Because its inversion temperature is in the range of 200 to 275 degrees Celsius. If you do very fast heating, then a lot of stresses in the inner parts of the investment material are generated, which cracks the investment, right? When you heat up this assembly, so you have this crucible base former, you have this sprue pattern, you have this wax pattern, right? And you have it surrounded by your investment, right? Now if you are heating up in order to do the wax burnout, if you heat up this cristobalite containing investment very rapidly, especially till a temperature of 300 degrees Celsius, then what's going to happen is the outer layers get restricted. The expansion of the outer layers get restricted by the surrounding rigid metal investment ring. Okay, so it generates an inward compressive stress on the inner layers, which due to heat are expanding outward. So they are under tensile stress, they are trying to expand outwards, right? Which is being restricted by a counter compressive stress, right? And that creates radial cracks from inward to outward. And that generates, when eventually casting will be done, when molten alloy would flow after the wax burnout, then that molten alloy would enter these small cracks. And when you retrieve the casting, those sharp metal projections will be seen on the casting in the form of fins and spines, right? So in order to reduce the incidence of fins and spines, you need to do slow heating till at least a temperature of 300 degrees Celsius during wax burnout, especially in a cristobalite containing investment material, right? So that's the applied MCQ that comes here, okay? Next question is, while assisting for delivering an all ceramic restoration, the chairside assistant got accidentally exposed to HF, hydrofluoric acid. What is the antidote? Now, this is something that you have to memorize. Can't help you much with this. The answer is calcium gluconate, guys, right? What are the other applied MCQs that you get? So he's basically, you'll be thinking, what is this HF, right? This HF is basically a ceramic conditioner, just like phosphoric acid is the tooth conditioner, it's the tooth etchant, right? In order to create irregularities on the tooth surface to enhance micromechanical bonding. Similarly, HF is used on the tissue surface of a ceramic crown. So this is a ceramic crown and this is the tissue surface, okay, the inner surface. This entire thing is the tissue surface. So you are conditioning this with HF to create irregularities on the inner surface of the ceramic crown. The other very important point is that ceramic crowns can be made of typically the feldspathic, siliceous porcelains, right? Then you have those which are based on aluminous porcelains, aluminous ceramics, and you have zirconia, right? Now, HF doesn't really work well on aluminous and zirconia, right? HF works well on siliceous porcelains, right? So when you're talking of feldspathic porcelains, right? Right, like IPS Empress and IPS Empress 2, right? IPS Empress 2, which would be lithium disilicate crowns and inlays and onlays. So that's also silicate based. So here HF works well. So classically in traditional feldspathic porcelains and lithium disilicate restorations, HF, hydrofluoric acid, works well to etch the inner surface of the crowns, and then obviously you use your silane coupling agent, apply that, which is basically equivalent to the primer of the bonding agent of the tooth. So then you use silane coupling agent, which really wets the surface of the irregular surface created by the HF on the inner surface of your siliceous porcelain crown or inlay or onlay, right? And then you bond, right? So that is the applied MCQs that you can come that can come. Next question is, activator in a light cure composite is. Now this is interesting, guys. So when you talk of the light cure composite, any composite, they talk of the composition, you obviously are going to be having the dimethacrylates, okay? Then you're going to be having the initiator, you're going to be having the activator, okay? So what is the activator and the initiator? The initiator would be the source of the free radical, and activator is the source of energy which would generate the free radical, okay? So activator for light cure is nothing but blue light, right? And what is the initiator? Initiator is the camphor quinone dimethyl amino ethyl methacrylate complex, okay? So here, never ever go for camphor. When asked about activator, many students just directly jump onto the answer of, whenever they see light cure, they see CQ, camphorquinone and dimethyl amino ethyl methacrylate. That's not the answer, guys. For activator, which is the source of energy, it's visible blue light, right? typically in the range of 450 to 470 nanometers, right? So visible blue light is the answer. Next, gas entrapment within a mold leads to which type of porosity in the casting? Okay, so here gas entrapment within the mold. This would lead to back pressure porosity. Okay, so let's look at what exactly is happening. This is your investment mold, right? That's your crucible former base, that's your sprue, that's your wax pattern, okay? And that's the end of the wax pattern, okay? And that's the end of the casting ring, right? So once you do your wax burnout, you want this entire residue of the wax to be completely, what is wax? Hydrocarbons, right? So hydrogen and carbon has to escape out. Now it escapes out through the thinner end mostly, right? The thinner end is the end of the casting ring, right? So it is of gypsum bonded or phosphate bonded or silicate bonded, right? Now, okay, so this is of whatever, irrespective of whatever material it is, the material would be definitely porous, slightly porous. You have gypsum, if it's a gypsum bonded investment material, it would be porous. If it's a phosphate bonded investment material, it would be porous. So it is through the interconnected, small pores in the investment material that this wax residue has to be vented out, right? Has to be flushed out, right? With heat during the wax burnout process. If that doesn't happen, then what happens? The gases will get trapped in these pores, causing a back pressure which would eventually prevent the inflow of molten metal into the investment mold cavity, right? And that would lead to some kind of porosity known as back pressure porosity. That's the best answer here. Okay, right? So that's the answer here. The other thing that can happen due to the development of back pressure, if it is so severe, you can actually get an incomplete casting as well. So we can actually get an incomplete casting as well. So just in case you get a question in which both the options are there and you're asked and you have a multiple correct answer based question, then and you have that option, like say A option is this, B option, say A option is back pressure, second option is incomplete casting, and then you have certain other options, and then there are the correct options are the combination answers. So you have to go for a combination of these two. Single best answer, back pressure porosity. Okay, yes, that's the other applied question that you can get. The third applied question that you can get is an IBQ. So you have this typical diagram from your Phillips, okay, which is showing you this kind of depressions, right, on the tissue surface of the casting, right, on the cavity side of a casting, right, caused by back pressure porosity. Okay, so you'll have to make a mental picture of this kind of an image, because if an image based question comes for back pressure porosity, you will definitely get this because that's your standard book, right? So these are the other important MCQs that you can get. Then next question is from the chapter of finishing and polishing, guys. Crocus cloth. What is crocus cloth? So you'll have to memorize this. Can't help you much with this. Crocus cloth is nothing but rouge. And what is rouge? Iron oxide. Okay, iron oxide. And this is typically used to polish metallic restorations. Metallic restorations like gold based inlays, onlays, and your direct filling gold restorations, right? This typically is applied on, say, a felt wheel and then rubbed onto the tooth surface. Finishing and polishing, usually for better visibility, is done at low speeds, and ideally a lot of water should be used so that the heat is not generated. But because finishing and polishing is supposed to be very precise, you can do it dry, but The only thing is that if you're doing it dry, you have to use very low speed so that you do not generate too much of frictional heat, right? So that is a couple of applied MCQs, clinical MCQs that you have to keep in mind. The other important thing from your finishing and polishing materials that you should keep in mind is the classification based on natural abrasives and synthetic or manufactured abrasives. Okay, so in this, just remember the synthetic or manufactured abrasive by the mnemonic of STARS, STARS, stars. Okay, so S would be silicon carbide. This is also known as carborundum. T is tin oxide. A is alumina. R is rouge. So the other MCQ that you get is rouge is, or crocus cloth is, a manufactured abrasive. It's not found naturally. Okay. Then S is synthetic diamond or artificial diamond. Okay. Just remember one more thing. Alumina is also found naturally. So alumina is also a part of natural abrasives where it is known as corundum. So please memorize this. The natural abrasive form of alumina which exists as an ore, which is mined, right, is corundum, whereas carborundum is silicon carbide, which is a manufactured abrasive. Okay. So these are the other applied, and obviously natural diamond or simply diamond is a natural abrasive. So if simply asked diamond, it is natural. Okay. But specifically asked synthetic diamond, then it's a synthetic or manufactured abrasive. So we can keep these things in mind so that we are able to solve the other applied MCQs here. So here crocus cloth is rouge. That's the answer. Okay. Then next question is, okay, this is a important, this is actually a, I think a PYQ. I deliberately put this here simply to tell you that just solve this question by a common sense. Okay. No need to memorize the values of the Knoop hardness number of these things. So if you see the Knoop hardness number, obviously the hardest substance is diamond. So that's there only in one option. So you have diamond, then you have silicon carbide, and then you have composite. So that's the answer. Just because it's a PYQ, I've asked you to, I've put this question here. The other important thing is no need to memorize the values. Okay, so just for your knowledge in the explanation, I think you have the explanation here. So we've provided you with that as well. So just a quick review of that. You see here, the values of Knoop hardness number of diamond is 7,000 to 10,000. Okay, whereas that of silicon carbide is just 2,500 and that of composite is just 30 to 55. So this is just for perspective, but this question can be solved by sort of, by common sense. Okay. Next question, cutting efficiency. Now this is a good applied question, guys. Cutting efficiency of abrasive instruments is not reduced by. Okay. So the answer here, first of all, is dressing of the instrument. Okay. So what is dressing, guys? So you have an abrasive instrument. Now this is a very, very important question. This is a brand new applied question that I made simply inspired by the fact that you had a very tough new question regarding truing and dressing that came in NEET 2025. Okay. So I just want you to be very clear with this. So I created this kind of a new question so that you're able to revise this confusing topic of truing, dressing, and blinding repeatedly. So cutting efficiency of abrasive instruments is not reduced by dressing of the instrument. So first of all, what does dressing do? The most important thing. You make an abrasive run against a harder block of another abrasive like diamond, right? So it's a block which is consisting of diamond particles, which is the hardest substance. Now it does two things. First is, very importantly, while you're using these abrasives, right, they get clogged with a lot of debris that they are abrading, that they cut. And what does that do? that makes the abrasive completely smooth. And you keep on rubbing, and if you do not clean it, you keep on rubbing the substrate, you're not removing any material, you're just increasing the heat. So you're actually reducing the efficiency of cutting, right? Efficiency of abrading. Efficiency versus effectiveness, right? Very important concept which we study in operative armamentarium. Efficiency is the amount of heat generated during cutting by a burr, right? And effectiveness is related to the total amount of tooth structure that is being cut. So clinically, efficiency is also very important. Effectiveness is also very important. Now, I might be cutting a lot of tooth structure, but if I'm generating too much heat, I would end up killing the pulp, right? So if your abrasive instrument is filled with clogged debris and you're not cleaning it, then you are generating too much of heat, okay? So that process of clogging of the abrasive with a lot of debris is basically known as blinding, okay? And if you're not cleaning this, you're reducing the efficiency. So if you rub this against a harder substrate and you clean it of its debris, you're restoring its efficiency. So you're increasing the efficiency, right? So that is one of the purposes of dressing. And obviously the other is to change the shape. So if I have an abrasive like this and I have to convert it into a pear-shaped abrasive for better polishing of my interdental areas, then that is also the second function of dressing. So the answer here is dressing, guys, because dressing is the process which ensures that the cutting efficiency is not reduced. Cutting efficiency is not reduced. Okay, it's restored. Otherwise, heat generation, too much or too little lubricant. See, if it's too much lubricant, the instrument is just going to, kind of just float in the air, right? Just float on the lubricant without adequate contact to the substrate. If it's too little lubricant, again, too much heat is generated. And obviously, third option is too much heat is generated. So cutting efficiency is reduced. So cutting efficiency of the abrasive instruments is not reduced by dressing of the instrument, right? Next question. Distortion of a wax pattern results from. So what he's talking of is you have a, right, this is the, say, occlusal view of a nice class 2 inlay prep, okay? And you're creating a wax pattern, right? You take it out and you want to invest it, right? So you have a screw. Now, if you have a too thick a screw and the wax pattern is too thin, that can distort the wax pattern. If it's too thin, if the screw is too thin, that can cause localized shrinkage porosity, right? So one reason of distortion of a wax pattern is too thick a sprue, too thick sprue which is attached to the wax pattern. Okay. What is the other? Obviously physical deformation. So while taking it out, removing it, investing it, storing it, too much of, physical damage would distort the wax pattern, right? The other is occluded air in the pattern. So occluded air would also lead to distortion because once it's again heated, that occluded air would get released and it would distort the wax pattern, okay? Less time during storage, obviously that's something that we want. So that would not distort, that would actually help in maintaining the dimensional stability of the wax pattern, okay? So option becomes D, that is both A and B can cause distortion of a wax pattern, okay? And obviously applied question is if you have another option of too thick a sprue, that can cause distortion of the wax pattern. What is the other option also? The other option is that can cause distortion of a wax pattern, guys, is that during cooling of a wax pattern, right? So you're making a wax pattern by melting the wax, right? And then during cooling, if you're applying too much pressure, right, on the wax pattern, then while reheating it again, yes, the wax pattern is going to show a very significant increase in thermal expansion, right? the increase in thermal expansion beyond the glass transition temperature for a wax pattern which has sustained compression or external force during cooling is going to be very exponentially much more. So that is also one of the reasons of distortion of wax pattern, right? Okay, guys, next question. Which of the following statements is false regarding HF? Okay, again, this question is from HF. Primarily, the indication of HF is basically conditioning of your crown, which is made of all ceramic crown, okay, and that too on the tissue surface, right, the inside surface, and that too primarily made of, a crown which is feldspathic, right, which is basically formed by hot isostatic pressing, IPS Empress 1 and IPS Empress 2, which is lithium disilicate, okay. Now this HF is typically used in very low concentrations, only up to 8 to 9%, and you have to apply this HF for much more than what you apply your phosphoric acid to the tooth. You apply phosphoric acid just for 15 seconds, but HF you can apply for about 60 to 90 seconds, okay. And then you wash it off, and then you place your silane coupling agent, which is also known as ceramic primer, right? That couples it with the bonding agent that you're going to apply to cement this crown onto the tooth, okay? And now what is he saying? Which of the following statements is false regarding HF? It is used to enhance bonding of ceramic restoration to cement. Now that's a true statement. It can cause a chemical burn. Yes, it's a very strong acid. Calcium gluconate is the antidote. Yes, it is a very mild acid. That's false, okay? So that's the answer. Why? It is a very strong corrosive acid, okay? So it's a mild acid. That's a false statement. So that's another new question, applied question that I made, simply because, again, HF, a couple of questions were asked in the recent NEET 2025 paper, right? They asked about the antidote. So it's good to know the other conceptual points regarding HF, okay? Next question. Now, interesting, guys, again, from casting investments and porosities, I specifically wanted to put a few questions from the same topic here in this GT so that that entire topic gets revised, right? So porosity caused by simultaneous nucleation of solid grains and gas bubbles at the first moment that the alloy freezes at the mold walls is. Now, the answer here is subsurface, okay? So that's the answer. Now, guys, basically what he's saying is you have this investment ring, you have this crucible former base, you have this sprue, you have this wax pattern, okay, surrounded by your investment material. Yes. Now, imagine a situation in which the sprue length of the sprue channel is short, right? Is short, and the thickness of the sprue is pretty wide, right? So a lot of molten metal is going to come inside. So a lot of molten metal is going to come inside, right? So when this lot of molten metal is going to come inside and it freezes at the walls of the investment mold cavity walls, okay? So the first point that it freezes, the first point is the point where the solid grains of the molten alloy are going to solidify. But if there is uncontrolled, right, a lot of volume of the molten alloy is coming inside, right, then there's going to be some turbulence and it's going to form some gas bubbles. That turbulence is going to release some bubbling, okay, because there's no smooth laminar, kind of smooth movement because of the high volume. There's some gas bubbles. Now, at the level of the investment mold wall, the first point where there is simultaneous nucleation of these gas bubbles, and the first point where the solid grains of the molten alloy are going to solidify, there is going to be some porosity, and that porosity is known as subsurface porosity, right? So that's the MCQ here. That's straight from the definition. That's the definition, okay? Porosity caused by simultaneous nucleation of solid grains and gas bubbles at the first moment that the alloy freezes at the investment mold walls is subsurface porosity. So the other applied MCQ that can come is that in order to reduce the incidence of subsurface porosity, guys, in order to reduce the incidence of subsurface porosity, what you can do is you can control the flow of molten alloy, right? How can you do that? By having a longer sprue and a narrower sprue, right? So that would help in controlling the movement, the inflow of the molten alloy, and that would reduce the subsurface porosity. What is the drawback of doing this? If you have too long a sprue, yes, you can have localized shrinkage porosity, and if you have too narrow a sprue, you can have localized shrinkage porosity. So you need to balance the two. It can't be too long, it can't be too short. If it's too long, you will be facing with localized shrinkage porosity. If it's too short, you will be facing with subsurface porosity. If it's too narrow, you will be facing with localized shrinkage porosity. If it's too wide, you will be facing with subsurface porosity. So it all has to be balanced correctly so that you don't have any of these problems, right? Okay, next question is from dental ceramics. Extremely important and a very frequently asked question. Transformation toughening of zirconia occurs due to change in phase from. The answer is tetragonal to monoclinic, right? What is the concept behind it, and what are the other applied MCQs that can be asked? Okay, guys. So basically, if you heat, when you're making these zirconia crowns, and when it's facing a temperature in the range of 1500 to 2000 degrees Celsius, okay, then zirconia exists as tetragonal stage, okay, and while at this temperature comes down, it cools to in the range of 1150 to 1167 degrees Celsius and below. That means still the room temperature. So in this entire range, that entire tetragonal is going to convert into monoclinic stage, okay. Now in general, guys, monoclinic has got a greater volume. The size of the crystal structure of monoclinic is greater than that of tetragonal, right? Now, in order to have some resistance to crack propagation in a crown made of zirconia, I want a simultaneous increase in crystal size volume so that can compress the developing crack, so that crack does not kind of propagate, okay? Right? So I want my zirconia to exist as tetragonal and change into monoclinic when the external stresses cause crack formation. How am I going to do that? Because below a temperature of 1150 to 1167 degrees Celsius, and below that is up to room temperature, that's around 25 degrees Celsius, it exists as monoclinic. Now, monoclinic already has a larger volume of the crystal size, right? So I want my zirconia to exist as tetragonal. I want it to exist as tetragonal at lower temperatures, right? And then when crack formation takes place, I want it to then transform into monoclinic. So how do I do that? I dope it with yttria, yttrium oxide dioxide, and cerium dioxide. And that helps me in just about keeping the zirconia in its tetragonal stage. And that is known as TZP, tetragonal zirconia polycrystals. Okay. Now this tetragonal stage is metastable, not very stable, because it's artificially created, right? It's not the natural tendency of zirconia. It's artificially created, okay? So I deliberately dope it with yttria and ceria, and I create this artificial condition, right? So as soon as the crack develops on a crown, the tetragonal changes into monoclinic, increases the volume. So when say a crack is developing here and a tetragonal stage changes into a greater volume of monoclinic, that tends to compress the crack, right? And that tends to kind of decelerate the crack propagation. So that is known as transformation toughening. So you need to know this theory. You need to know these these temperature transformations, so that if an applied question come, and this is the time for applied questions. Since the last 2.5 years, I've been seeing that this straight up question is being asked again and again. Definitely a time is coming where your question would be revolving around some more theory regarding this, and then you'll get confused, guys. So that was the main purpose of putting this question here. Now the next question, friends, is from your casting investments and procedures, specifically the casting defects. The examiner has asked the type of porosity caused by improper wax burnout. So let's just put this in perspective. We have this crucible former base, the sprue, the wax pattern, and the end of the casting ring. All right. Now you place this in the burnout furnace, okay, and you've started your heating cycle. And because of whatever reason, like probably the cycle was of short duration or the adequate temperature was not there. So what has happened is that the wax has not completely burnt out. Rather, in the end of the investment ring, whether it's a gypsum bonded, phosphate, or silicate bonded, some of the residue of the wax has clogged the pores. So what's going to happen is that gases won't be able to completely escape out of the investment mold. So those gases would create a back pressure when subsequently during the casting process you're trying to force the molten alloy into the sprue channel. This would create a back pressure and porosity might occur in the casting. So this is back pressure porosity. So D is the answer, back pressure porosity. Next question, which graph amongst these following represents plastic rheologic behavior? So guys, what is plastic? It behaves exactly like a Newtonian. That means if you see the shear stress versus strain rate curve would be like Newtonian, that's a straight line, but you would need a certain amount of force to external pressure or stress to overcome the yield strength of this material. Once that is overcome, then the material starts to behave like an ideal liquid. Okay, so that is a plastic or a Bingham kind of a behavior. Plastic or Bingham, and graph 1 represents this behavior, right? So there's a critical value of shear stress that has to be applied to overcome the yield strength. Once that is done, then it is a plastic or Bingham material. Okay, so graph 1 represents the plastic or Bingham material. What is false regarding, next question, what is false regarding the spherical protuberance present below the wax pattern? So let's just first identify what is this. This is your crucible former base, that's your sprue, and this is a dilatation, which is basically the reservoir. This is the reservoir for your adequate volume of molten alloy to remain here, so that when it is feeding the investment mold cavity here, then as it is solidifying, some shrinkage is taking place in the most important casting area. So you have adequate volume of molten alloy which would keep feeding this. So whatever porosity will take place should take place in the reservoir, not in the casting. That's the logic of having a reservoir, which prevents localized shrinkage porosity. Now, as you can see here, this is one single reservoir, so it's basically connected to one wax pattern. So based on this knowledge, let us see the options, and what they've asked is false statement. Okay, false statement for this. So it is a reservoir, that's true. It is in the shape of a sphere for a single pattern, that's also true. It is in the shape of a sphere for a bridge pattern, that's false. It is in the shape of a runner bar for a bridge pattern, that is actually also false. Okay, so I think here there is a slight kind of incomplete, there's a typo error. Basically this is a multiple correct answer type of a question. So both C and D are the answers, guys. Both C and D
are the answers because both are false statements. So when I made this question, there was like, oh, A is the answer, A, B, C, C, and D. Okay. So I think the complete answer, the complete question was not typed here, but both C and D are right. So don't worry. This is for your knowledge. This is an applied question. Both C and D are incorrect, and both are the answers because they have asked the false statements. Right? Right, guys? So stay connected with us on the Telegram group for your doubt solving. And I wish you all the very best. Thank you, guys. Keep studying hard. Thank you.